Next up, we have Evan again, lead software engineer, App Inventor.
Good morning, everyone. I've got a little clock here. OK. Let's get started. So for those of you who have been to some of the other Blockly summits, you may be familiar that I did a talk in 2019 at the Blockly Summit on performance of Blockly, specifically in App Inventor. And I decided to revisit that this year because we, as well at App Inventor, are a fairly old project. In fact, we existed before Blockly existed, as I recounted yesterday. And so we have a lot of baggage, like Code.org, in terms of what we've done to Blockly over the years. And Becca, who I think is downstairs at the check-in. Oh, no, you're here. OK, hi. Becca's been helping us with trying to become a little bit more current. And I thought, since we're working on bringing App Inventor up to date with Blockly, let's revisit the performance numbers from before. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, this is the history of App Inventor. And for those of you watching on YouTube recording later, App Inventor was started here at Google. It was open source to MIT. It became one of the first use cases for Blockly. And Neil, I think, has a story of how that came to be from that same summit I mentioned earlier. And we've got 19 million users now and 90 million projects since I made this slide. So here are the findings I have from 2019. So people actually build really complicated projects in App Inventor. Some of the projects at the time were close to 10,000 blocks in terms of size. And we had a couple different complaints from users. One is that dragging stuff around was slow. And the first thing we did was we turned off the drag layer, and that actually improved performance for a lot of our users. Collapsing and expanding blocks was very slow, and arranging blocks is very slow. We have, in that talk, I talked about how we've improved a lot of those things, and a lot of that functionality has been brought back into Blockly Core. And this was just a little view of some of the projects at the time. So you see people build a lot of very small projects, but then we had, in the thousands of blocks count. And if we reorganize that a little bit using log scale, you can see that there's quite a bit of drop-off around 300 or so blocks. There seems to be some barrier that kind of prevents people from building applications much larger than that, although they do try. And there might be a lot of reasons for that too, right? So performance is just one angle at which we're looking at this problem. And the takeaways that I presented in that talk were basically, look at what your users do, measure what you need to measure. DevTools are your friend, which Becca mentioned yesterday in her talk on performance. And at the time, we weren't at 10,000 blocks, but we expected, we probably will see a 10,000 block plus app in App Inventor fairly soon. So, jumping ahead to now, we've been working on updating App Inventor's version of Blockly. And here's just a sample of the problems we're running into. So in core itself, we've made about 8,000 additions and 3,000 deletions. We've added about 5,000 lines of monkey patches. And overall, our additions on top of Blockly, just in terms of JavaScript code, is about 35,000 lines. And we need to make sure it all works. So the first thing that we were pointed to is the migration script. And I've been told that this has already been fixed. Yes, OK. Because Becca told me, oh, we use regex, and said, oh, so now I have two problems. So we had these fun little things where it rewrites code that's clearly syntactically incorrect. We caught these pretty quickly, obviously, because it doesn't really run if you have this code in there. But that brings me to a very important point. Take all the numbers I'm going to show you now with a big grain of salt, because we're still in the process of optimizing all this stuff, and the numbers are going to be subject to change as part of our continued update process. OK, so regarding the methodology of this, I actually used the exact same machine that I used for the 2019 talk. So the only real difference here is in terms of the browser versions, because it's very hard to go back and find older versions of the different browsers. And in fact, in Apple land, right, with Safari, you can't easily go back because it's tied to the OS version. I broke down everything into these sort of two stages. So the first is the loading stage, the actual process of taking the XML and loading that into the workspace, and then separately kind of looking at the rendering process and how quickly we can get to drawing the SVG. And just to keep it simple, I ran 6 runs of each of the different projects I'm going to show you. We dropped the first one to let the browser kind of warm up a little bit. So the numbers are here, the average of the 5 other runs. Now, this is the results from the 2019 talk. And in particular, we're going to focus on these 2 projects, which are our Yahtzee application. And it's, I think, got a couple hundred blocks in it. So it's not a terribly huge program, but it's a decent size. And as we saw in the unoptimized versions of Blockly at the time, on occasion, we were getting up to 9 seconds to draw certain operations. And we had, at the time, in App Inventor, a feature called render down, where if you kept the blocks collapsed, you got significant improvements in performance. So here are the results for today. And in fact, you'll see that the new rendering system in Blockly is doing a really good job. So congratulations for all your work on trying to optimize for performance. In fact, it's doing even better than our render down numbers were from the previous slide. So definitely seeing an improvement. So now we're down about a second for that same exact set of projects. And as you can see, also, obviously, small projects obviously should be very fast. Yahtzee here, the 1,200 blocks is a much bigger size. But what about that 10,000 block project? Well, I found an even bigger one, 13,000 blocks. And as you can see, the performance scales rather linearly. So loading and rendering this workspace takes anywhere between about 12 seconds and 16 seconds, depending on the browser. And the interesting thing that I found here is it is mainly in the Firefox column, if you look. Firefox's loading time is a little bit slower. So whatever it's doing in terms of DOM manipulation seems to slow it down. But then it makes up for it a lot in the rendering of the SVG. So I think part of that is we need to look at what optimizations could be done in the browser to try to account for this. And the other thing I'm really looking forward to will be with the new version switching over to the JSON serialization, because half the time is spent just dealing with the XML, right? So I'm hoping that those numbers will come down greatly once we can switch over to some of these newer technologies. So following up, recommendations to explore, I did want to repeat some of the comments from 2019. Continue to look at what your users do, because it does surprise us. Certainly, I didn't think people would have the wherewithal to wait 20 seconds to load a project, but they do. Again, you don't know what you don't measure. And one thing that's really important here is adding more useful abstractions. So we have been adding new blocks to App Inventor to try to offer newer functionality. In a recent update, we added things for map, reduce, filters, sort of the functional operators you'd have in a standard programming language. And we believe that that can cut down on a lot of the functions that people are kind of building into their apps by default by giving them a single block that's very, very powerful. Again, JSON, as I mentioned, I think the JSON serialization is going to greatly improve performance. Unfortunately, I don't have numbers for that yet. And there may be other optimizations still possible, especially around some of the SVG manipulations. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Great, thanks, Evan. I see one question potentially in the room. Live stream, feel free to add them to the chat. We'll start with Mary Beth.
App Inventor, everything is on one workspace. Is that true?
Yes and no. So people can have multiple screens in their application, and each screen has its own workspace that provides the behavior for that specific screen.
Cool. So I'm wondering, because now that we have the shared procedures, I'm wondering if App Inventor is considered like maybe letting people break their workspace apart, since you can share procedures across workspaces now, so people could define functions in one and call them in another?
I mean, that's certainly something we can explore. A lot of times we don't necessarily see people encapsulating their behavior in procedures. Again, because a lot of our users tend to be novices or not particularly sophisticated developers. They don't necessarily recognize that they can abstract something into a procedure and then call it from multiple places. So you'll see a lot of like copy and pasted code and stuff like that.
Got it.
In the case of that, some of these larger projects, both the Yahtzee one and the one that was 13,000 blocks, there is significant use of procedures. So yes, I would imagine that we would see some additional benefit to allowing them to use the shared procedure workspace.
Cool. Thanks.
Great. I have a question.
Yes.
So this was a follow-up to your past talk. As you were looking at these things again, did anything feel even more surprising than last time?
I guess the major thing that I would say is that, well, I guess it wasn't totally surprising. It's surprising in the sense that, yes, people are building even larger workspaces. And in fact, the major thing is that when we did the update in 2017, people were complaining that Blockly seemed a lot slower when we did that jump. And that was the motivation for the first talk. I'm really interested to see, once we put this new version out, how people are going to respond to that. Because the situation with Firefox that I showed there kind of, it validates what we've been seeing on the forum for our community, where someone will come in, I can't open my project anymore, and they'll say, have you tried it in Firefox yet? And then they go to Firefox, and then it works fine because it shaves 25% off the load time. So there are definitely things that I think we could be exploring. I would definitely love to figure out a way of like talking to the Chrome team and seeing what performance improvements could be done there. In particular, because both Edge and Chrome now are based on Chromium. So if we can improve the SVG and the rendering performance at that level, then it would benefit multiple browsers.
Sure. Great. Any other questions in the room? I'm going to check the stream one more time. All right, it looks like we're good. Thank you,
All right.
Evan.
Thank you
I'll
very
pass it
much.
back to Rachel.